Namaskar, I am Dr. Nalini Avinash Wagmare, working as an associate professor at Tilak Maharashtra Vidyapit, Pune. Today's our topic is related to Indian Council Act of 1919. What we have to study in this presentation causes to introduction of Act of 1919, main features of Act of 1919, defects of this act as well as importance of this act, and various scholars given a different opinion about this act, summary and some reference books. So what were the causes to introduce this act? Government of India Act 1919 is also called as a Montego-Chelmsford Reforms Act. The capture of the state of the Congress by the extremists, the demand of Home Rule, the Lucknow Pact in 1916, the help provided by the Indians to the government in the First World War, and the sympathetic attitude of the ruling Liberal Party in India resulted in the passing of the Act 1919, which brought about changes in the home government, the government of India, and the provisional government. So we know that there are so many reasons to start this extremism in India. Under that, we also find the inadequacy of judicial reforms of Britishers, social and political discontentment of the British government, poverty in India, famines and calamities also one more reasons, along with the humiliation of Indians in India and abroad, leadership of extreme, that is Lal Bal Pal. Under that also the revival of Hindu religion as well as the leadership or what we say oppressive measures of Lord Curzon also. These are the few reasons the extremism arise in India. Under that, the demand of home rule. The Bal Gangadhar Tilak wanted to home rule Swaraj for India, self-rule government for India. And it is also one more reason to introduce this act. Another reason is the Lucknow Pact, where the moderate extremists as well as Muslim League come together and discuss the freedom for India. Along with one more reason is the First World War took place in the world for democracy purpose. And the another reason, the Liberal Party in Britain favored the Indians to get the freedom from the British government. These are the few reasons. Now the British government decided to introduce some acts in favor of the Indians to give them some assurance as well as good governance in India. The enactment of the Government of India Act 1919 was regarded as a landmark in the constitutional development of India. This was based on the Montego-Chelmsford report. It is to be noted that Lord Montego visited India and he was accompanied with the Viceroy, Lord Chelmsford. They traveled all over India with the object to study the Indian problems, and they prepared reformative report. This is called the Montego-Chelmsford report. Then the increasing participation of Indians in the administration of the country. On April 1916, Lord Chelmsford assumed the office of the Governor General of India, and he expressed the opinion that the participation of Indians should be increased in the administration of the country. So on 20th August 1970, Mr. Montego assumed the office of the Secretary of India, and they had given serious thought to the problems in India. Consequently, an announcement in the British Parliament was made that the policy of His Majesty stood changed, and now Indians would be given association rather than participation in every branch of governing institute, with a view to the progressive realization of responsible government in India. At that time, British government promised that the policy of home rule and self-government would be attained in the manner of gradual progress. Step by step, they have ready to give us freedom. The cooperation of Indians was sought by them for the welfare and advancement of the Indians. Then on July 1918, after due deliberations and discussions, the Montego-Chelmsford report was published, paving the way for Indian constitutional reforms. Notably, in Montego-Chelmsford's report, 4 formulas were suggested. This way, as far as possible, the local bodies should be subjected to complete control by the popular elected persons. The provincial government should be given responsibility and independence to look after the administrative legislative, and financial affairs. The Government of India must remain fully responsible to the British Parliament. In the meantime, the Indian Legislative Council should be subjected to be enlarged and made more representative. Gradually, the control of British Parliament and the Secretary of State over the Government of India and provisional government must be relaxed. On the basis of report, a bill was represented to the British Parliament and it was referred to Joint Select Committee of both the houses of British Parliament. Further, the report of Joint Select Committee was represented to the British Parliament, and finally in December 1919, the bill was passed and enacted as the Government of India Act 1919. The preamble of the Act 1919. The preamble of the Government of India Act 1919 has total reflection of the announcement made by His Majesty's Government in the British Parliament in August 1917. In the view of Sir Tej Bahadur Sapur in contained as follows. India to remain an integral part of the British Crown. Paramount objective to provide responsible government to India. Progressive realization of the policy of self-government. To achieve the objective of responsible government and home rule, a systematic gradual development process to be undertaken and increasing association of Indians in every branch of administration to be favored. His Majesty directed the Governor General of India to function according to the provisions incorporated in the Government of India Act 1990 and the vigilant in implementing the provision. Then let's see what were the special features of the Government of India Act 1990. Participation. The Act 1919 provided for the increasing association of Indians in every branch of administration in India. Then their declaration, the Act 1990 promised to give responsible government to the Indians. Then double rule in the provinces. The Government of India Act 1990 introduced the system of double rule in the provinces. This is also called hierarchy system in the provinces. The basic objective of double rule was to give exposure to the natives in the machinery of self-government. The legislative of subjects were divided into the provisional and central. The provisional legislative subjects were further divided into reserve and transfer subjects. Then which were the reserve subject and which were the transfer subject, who were the authority on it? Justice, finance, jail, police, irrigation were comparatively more important subjects and were reserved to the exclusive area of legislation by the governor and his executive council. Then transfer subjects, the subjects of lesser importance like education, agriculture, and local self-government were transferred to the Indian ministers and the governors. The governor had special power to override both the ministers and the executive council. Then the Provisional Legislative Council was authorized to make legislation in respect of the provisional matters only. But in certain matters, the prior sanction of the Governor General was mandatory. In fact, the Governor General was given unfettered power to stop the consideration of the bill or a part of the bill. The Governor General had also power to bring any subject into the category of reserved subject, and the consent of Council was not necessary for this purpose. The power to veto the bill was vested with the Governor General in the Provisional Legislative Council. The proportion of the elected members was raised up to 70%. However, the separate electorate for Muslims still remained. Then central government remained responsible to the British Parliament. By the Government of India Act, there was no system of responsible government in the center, whereas central government continued answerable to the British Parliament. However, through the Secretary of State, bicameral system was introduced in the center. Thus, there was bicameral legislature in the center. Central government remained responsible to the British Parliament. That is the Council of State, that is upper house was constituted of 60 members, of whom 30 members were elected, whereas the Legislative Council, that is lower house, was composed of a total of 144 members, of whom 104 were only elected and the remaining members were nominated. Among the nominated members, 26 were officials and rest of the members were non-officials. So the powers of the upper house and the lower house were equal, but the lower house was given exclusive power to veto a bill. For the whole of India, the central legislature, that is upper house, and the lower house had the power to legislate on any subject. So here the main power given to the central government, even the research subject and these all things in the hands of the Britishers, and the other houses they have given less importance. Then what were the defects of this act? Non-performance system of diarchy, dictatorial position of the Governor General, absence of responsible central government, advent of communalism on account of communal electorates, reforms introduced in an inappropriate time. The non-performance system of the diarchy. Non-performance system of diarchy, that is initially after the introduction of system of diarchy in the provinces, it worked in the spirit of harmony and cooperation between the provincial legislature and the executive council, but this broke down in 1924. It is the settled principle of good governance that mutual cooperation and practical unity are the two essential ingredients. But under the system of diarchy, the two parts, legislative and executive, never cooperate with each other harmoniously, because in the provincial legislature, the ministers were answerable to the people of its provinces, whereas the member of the executive council belonged to the bureaucracy. On most of the occasions, the governor of provinces shielded the action of the executive council as he himself belonged to the category of bureaucracy. Then other defects, the unscientific division of subjects of legislation caused a great hardship in the administration. That is, education being a transfer subject was assigned to a minister, but the matters of irrigation, agriculture, loans, and famine relief were kept in the category of the reserve subjects. So the industry was a transfer subject, but the Minister of Industry had no power over factories, electricity, water, power, and labor, as these were placed as a reserve subjects. Mr. K.V. Reddy, who was former Minister of Madras, rightly remarked, I was a Minister for Development without forest. I was a Minister for Agriculture minus irrigation. So subjects are confusing. That's why this is the one defects of this act. As a Minister of Agriculture, I had nothing to do with the Madras Agriculture Loans Act or the Madras Land Improvement Loans Act. Famine relief, of course, could not be touched by the Minister of Agriculture as stated by Mr. K.V. Reddy in his opinion. Then other defects. Under the scheme envisaged in the Act of 1990, the ministers were appointed by the governor. Obviously, the ministers were incapable to do anything without the governor's support. Whoever appointed, they are follow his instruction and order, they are under them. So they are not independently act anything. The system of communal and separate electorate, that is communal representation in the councils introduced in the Indian Council Act 1990 was continued under the system of diarchy in the Government of India Act 1990. As a result, there was groupism among the elected members as they were representing the community to which they belong. So here the mutual distrust as well as communal violence as well as disturbs started in India on the basis of their communal electoral system, which was introduced by the Britishers through this in earlier Act 1909 and this Act. In the absence of collective responsibility, the ministers never worked like a team. The governor deal with the minister individually with the view to discharge collective responsibility. Under the hierarchy system of governance, the minister was so helpless as the members of All India service were under the control of the Secretary of State for India, and their appointments, salaries, suspension, dismissal, and transfers were dealt with by the Secretary of State for India. Therefore, the members of All India service were heedless to the minister's attention. This attitude of members made the system hierarchy virtually unworkable. So there is no importance of this hierarchy system introduced there. Then the non-performance of the system of hierarchy was also due to the peculiar status of the finance department. Because under the system of hierarchy in the provinces, the finance was kept the reserved and transfer subject. A member of the Executive Council was made in charge of the Department of Finance, who was compelled to favor the wishes of the governor and his Executive Council. According to Mr. C.Y. Chintamani, to see that the reserve subject of the governor, that is finance, got all money and they required before the other departments got what they wanted. This partition working of the finance members caused potential failure of the system of hierarchy. Partiality system made, that is also one more defect of this act. Then dictatorial position of the Governor General. Under the reforms introduced in the Government of India Act 1990, the Governor Generals of India practically assumed the position of constitutional dictator. Especially in the financial matters, he had wide powers to use or misuse finance as per his whims and fancies. About 60% of the annual financial statement budget was excluded from the vote of the Central Legislative Council or Assembly. Again, in the case of emergency, he was the sole judge to decide upon the financial matters. He was also given the power to withhold or amend any bill as he liked presented to him for obtaining assent. On the other hand, the second chamber, that is the Council of State at Center, was planned and constituted with the view to give another safeguard to the government in the words, that is Mr. Srinivas Iyengar's state. At Center, the Council of State checkmated the Central Legislative Assembly and formed an impregnable citadel for the central government. As absence of responsible central government also, undoubtedly the Government of India Act provided increase of Indian members to Viceroy's Executive Council. But in the practical point of view, these members were proved to be puppets. In order to retain their position, they acted as yes men. Means they have not given any authorities to Indians, only acted as the puppets. Whatever Britishers say, they say okay for it. During the Indian National Congress, Amritsar session in 1990, Pandit Motilal Nehru, in his presidential address, remarked that the Government of India Act 1990 miserably failed to provide even impartial, responsible central government. It could not provide considerable or political power to the representative of Indians in the central government. Only on paper they have mentioned that one. Then advent of communalism on account of the communal electorates. Under the Government of India Act 1990, with view to provide the system of communal electorates, the idea of communal representation was encouraged. Under the said act, the communal representation to Christians, Sikhs, Europeans, Anglo-Indians, and Muslims was provided. So through this act, it clearly shows that now the Britishers wanted to divide out, cut Indian people among themselves and given the communal representative authorities to like Sikhs, Christians, Europeans, Anglo-Indians, and Muslims. So because of this, the scheme of communal electorates promoted the groupism among the Indians. Notably, Minto Morley reforms originated the concept of communal electorates, and the Montego Chamber reform rectified this concept. Finally, electorates were divided on the communal line. So these reforms what 1919 Act introduced inappropriate time, because April 13, 1990 witnessed the Jallianwala Bagh incident. Then the spirit of discontentment among Indians were at high at that time. As a result, horror and hatred organized against the British regime in the minds of Indian masses. Meanwhile, a wartime measure, that is Defense of India Act, expired in 1917. The British government of India constituted a committee under the leadership of Mr. Rowlatt to suggest measures in shape of the Defense of India Act. The report of Rowlatt Act was submitted in October 1918, which became an act. So, in a very critical, when the high nationalism at that time, so this act was introduced by the Britishers, where we find so many defects, not please the Indians, not favor the Indian government, Indian people also. Then communal factor showed over the reforms introduced by the government of India in 1990. The British imposed certain terms upon Turkey under the Treaty of Sevres in 1920, which was opposed by the Muslims in India. And as a result, the Khilafat movement was launched by the Muslims in India. At that time, Muslims were of the opinion that their loyalty to the British during the First World War fetched nothing to them. Consequently, Muslim League and the Indian National Congress jointly organized the Khilafat movement with the object to frustrate the British government. Therefore, in view of this reason, the constitutional reforms introduced by the Government of India in 1919 could not be implemented in the true spirit in such a non-conducive atmosphere. Then, a cause of the failure directly as established by the Act of 1919, the ministers had to depend on the governor for several things, particularly for finance. The minister did not work on the basis of joint responsibility, but on the contrary, they came in conflict on another, which reduced their honor and power further in relation to the governors and his councillors. Then, besides the passing of the Revolutionary Act, the beginning of non-cooperation movement, the civil disobedience movement, led by Mahatma Gandhi, and the non-cooperative functioning of Swaraj Party in the legislative councils, put obstructions in the working of hierarchy, and therefore it failed to achieve its object. Yet the Act 1919 was a set towards a responsible government and provided useful experience of administration to the Indians. Then result of the Act of 1919. But while the Act of 1919 failed to satisfy the Indians, the Revolutionary Act inflamed their passions and brought Mahatma Gandhi to the forefront of the national struggle. So this time Gandhiji taken the lead in India and started the national movement under the leadership of Gandhi. So Gandhi in the map of Indian national movement or became as a leader of Indian national movement. Then Gandhi started the first Satyagraha movement and also led the Khilafat movement, but both movements failed to achieve any object. However, the only gain of to 1919 was that the national movement entered the stage of becoming a mass movement under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi. Then Montesquieu Chelmsford Act reforms were considered to be utterly inadequate by the Indians. The Indian National Congress at its annual session in 1990 condemned the reforms as inadequate, unsatisfactory, and disappointing act stated by the Indian National Congress about this act. While it asked the British government to take early steps to establish self-responsible government in India, in accordance with the principle of self-determination, it resolved to work the reforms so far as may be responsible with the view to bring about the early establishment of responsible government in India. So, this act, briefly explained in this lecture, related to causes to introduce this act, merit of this act, demerit of this act, and impact of this act on Indian people. So you can refer these books for more detail. Thank you.